Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. This is Sutton Wall Street Trilogy, Part 13, Wall Street and FDR, Part 5. I see that we have Minoan in the chat. Hello. Chapter 6, Prelude to the New Deal. Whichever party gains the day, tyrants or demagogues are most sure to take the offices. Assemblyman Clinton Roosevelt of New York, 1841. The full story of the construction of corporate socialism in the U.S., as envisioned by the financier philosophers identified in the previous chapter, is beyond the scope of this book. But we can gain greater perspectives through a brief look at a few facets of the historical process. For example, Clinton Roosevelt's system, a century before FDR, Bernard Baruch's War Industries Board, and Paul Warburg's Federal Reserve System. In 1841, FDR's distant cousin, Assemblyman Clinton Roosevelt of New York, proposed a scheme resembling the New Deal for economic planning and control of society by the few. Under President Woodrow Wilson in 1918, Bernard Baruch, corporate socialist par excellence, followed the broad outline of the Roosevelt scheme, almost certainly unknowingly and probably unattributable to some unconscious parallelism of action, when he established the War Industries Board, the organizational forerunner of the 1933 National Recovery Administration. Some of the 1918 WIB corporate elite appointed by Baruch, Hugh Johnson, for example, found administrative niches in Roosevelt's NRA. In 1922, then Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover and up-and-coming Wall Streeter Franklin D. Roosevelt joined forces to promote trade associations, implementing Bernard Baruch's post-war economic planning proposals. Shortly thereafter, former socialist editor Benito Mussolini marched on Rome and established, with the liberal help from J.P. Morgan Company, the Italian corporate state, whose organizational structure is distinctly reminiscent of Roosevelt's NRA. In the United States, glorification of Mussolini and his Italian achievements was promoted by the ever-present financiers Thomas Lamont, Otto Kahn, and others. We will mention only briefly Wall Street involvement with both Bolshevik Russia and Hitler's Germany, both totalitarian states governed by self-appointed elite, as full treatment of these aspects is covered in other volumes. In brief, construction of FDR's National Recovery Administration was one facet of a wider historical process. Construction of economic systems where the few could profit at the expense of the many, the citizen taxpayer in the street, and all, of course, promoted under the guise of the public good, whether it was Stalin's Russia, Mussolini's Italy, Hitler's Germany, or Roosevelt's New Deal. Assemblyman Clinton Roosevelt's NRA, 1841. New York Assemblyman Clinton Roosevelt was a 19th century cousin of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and incidentally also related to President Theodore Roosevelt, John Quincy Adams, and President Martin Van Buren. Clinton Roosevelt's only literary effort is contained in a rare booklet dated 1841. In essence, this is a Socratic discussion between another Roosevelt and a producer, presumably representing the rest of us, i.e. the many. Roosevelt proposes a totalitarian government along the lines of George Orwell's 1984 society, where all individuality is submerged to a collective run by an elitist aristocratic group, i.e. the few, who enact all legislation. Roosevelt demanded ultimate but not immediate abandonment of the Constitution. Producer. But I ask again, would you at once abandon the old doctrines of the Constitution? Author. Not by any means. Not any more than if one were in a leaky vessel, he should spring overboard to save himself from drowning. It is a ship put hastily together when we left the British flag, and it was then thought an experiment of very doubtful issue. This early expression of Rooseveltian family skepticism towards the Constitution brings to mind the Supreme Court rejection in October 1934, Schuchter Poultry Court vs. U.S., of another Rooseveltian departure, an unfettered departure according to the court, from the rules of constitutional society, the National Recovery Act, itself an uncanny replica of Clinton Roosevelt's 1841 program for a collective economy. The earlier Rooseveltian system depended first on the art and science of cooperation. This is to bring the whole to bear for a mutual advantage. It is this cooperation, i.e. the ability to bring the whole to bear for the interest of the few, that is, as we have seen, the encompassing theme of the writings and preachings of Otto Kahn, Robert Brookings, Edward Filney, Myron Taylor, and the other financier philosophers discussed in Chapter 5. In the Roosevelt schema, each man rises through specific grades in the social system and is appointed to that class of work to which he is best suited, choice of occupation being strictly circumscribed. In the words of Clinton Roosevelt, P. Whose duty will it be to make appointments to each class? A. The Grand Marshals. P. Who will be accountable that the men appointed are the best qualified? A. A court of physiologists, moral philosophers, and farmers and mechanics to be chosen by the Grand Marshal and accountable to him. P. Would you constrain a citizen to submit their decisions in the selection of a calling? A. No. If anyone of good character insisted, he might try until he found the occupation most congenial to his tastes and feelings. Production in the system had to be equated with consumption, and the handling of excesses and deficiencies reflected the ideas pursued in the Swoop Plan, the literary base of Roosevelt's NRA. The system is certainly akin to that in Bernard Baruch's War Industries Board during World War I. This is how Clinton Roosevelt described the duties of the Marshal of Creation, whose job is to balance production and consumption. What is the duty of What is the duty of the Marshal of the creating or producing order? A. It is to estimate the amount of produce and manufactures necessary to produce a sufficiency in each department below him. When in operation, he shall report excesses and deficiencies to the Grand Marshal. P. How shall he discover such excesses and deficiencies? A. The various merchants will report to him the demand and supplies in every line of business, as will be seen hereafter. P. Under this order are agriculture, manufactures, and commerce, as I perceive. What then is the duty of the Marshal of Agriculture? A. He should have under him 4 regions, or if not, foreign commerce must make good the deficiency. P. What 4 regions? A. The temperate, the warm, the hot region, and the water region. P. Why divide them thus? A. Because the products of these different regions require different systems of cultivation and are properly subject to different mines. Then there is a Marshal of Manufacturers overseeing the whole system, similar to Baruch's position as economic dictator in 1918, and Hugh Johnson's position as administrator of the National Recovery Administration in 1833. The Marshal's functions are described by Clinton Roosevelt as follows. P. What are the duties of the Marshal of Manufacturers? A. He shall divide men into 5 general classes according to the printed diagram. 1. First, the manufacturers of all means of defense against the weather. Second, all kinds of viands. Third, metals and minerals. 4, chemicals. 5th, machinery. All these have on the printed diagrams banners with a glory on one side and an appropriate motto on the reverse, showing the advantage each class is to all others. And by the way, we would remark this should be universally adopted to give a just direction to man's love of glory. By a reference to the chart and what has been observed, the duties of the officers under this development will be obvious. The industrial categories of 1841 are not, of course, precisely the categories of 1930, but a generalized similarity can be traced. The first division is clothing and fabrics, limited in 1841 to cotton, wool, and linen, but extended today to synthetic materials, including plastics and fibers. The second division is that devoted to foodstuffs. The third division is devoted to raw materials, and the fourth division including medicines. The fifth is machinery. Today, the fifth division comprises the many subdivisions of electronics, mechanical, and civil engineering, but the 5 categories could be utilized to divide a modern economy. Clinton Roosevelt society can be summarized in this phase. The system should rule, and the system should look chiefly to the general good. Bernard Baruch's wartime dictatorship. While the Federal Reserve System and its private legal monopoly of the money supply has been a font of wealth for its operators, the ultimate goal of making society work for the few, as outlined by Frederick Howe and Clinton Roosevelt, can be brought about only by a planned control of the whole economy, and this requires compulsory adherence of the many smaller enterprises to the dictates of the few, deciding the plans to be followed. The genesis of Roosevelt's NRA, a system that included compulsory adherence by small entrepreneurs to a plan devised by big business, can be traced from Bernard Baruch's U.S. War Industries Board. Established and elaborated as an emergency wartime measure in 1915, before the U.S. entered World War I, Howard E. Coffin, then chairman of General Electric, headed the U.S. Committee on Industrial Preparedness. In company with Bernard Baruch and Daniel Willard of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, Coffin was also a member of the Advisory Commission to the Council of National Defense. In 1915, Bernard Baruch was invited by President Woodrow Wilson to design a plan for a defense mobilization committee. This Baruch plan subsequently became the War Industries Board, which absorbed and replaced the old General Munitions Board. Margaret L. Cott, Baruch's biographer, describes the War Industries Board as a concept similar to cooperative trade associations, a device long desired by Wall Street to control the unwanted rigors of competition in the marketplace. Committees of industry, big business and small business, both represent in Washington, and both with Washington representation back home, this could be the backbone of the whole structure. By March 1918, President Wilson, acting without congressional authority, had endowed Baruch with more power than any other individual had been granted in the history of the United States. The War Industries Board, with Baruch as its chairman, became responsible for building all factories and for the supply of all raw materials, all products, and all transportation. And all its final decisions rested with the chairman, Bernard Baruch. In brief, Baruch became economic dictator of the United States, or marshal of manufacturers, in Clinton Roosevelt's scheme. Yet, as Margaret Cott points out, the creation of this office was never specifically authorized by an act of Congress. So, by the summer of 1918, Baruch, with extraordinary and unconstitutional powers, had, in his own words, finally developed a scheme of positive control over the major portion of the industrial fabric. Success bred courage for more success, and trade after trade was taken under control with an increasing willingness on the part of the interests affected. At the time of the armistice, the WIB comprised Baruch, chairman, Alexander Legge of International Harvester, vice chairman, E.B. Parker and R.S. Brookings, whose ideas we have already examined, in charge of price fixing. Assistants to the chairman were Herbert Bayard Swoop, brother of Gerard Swoop of General Electric, Clarence Dillon of the Wall Street firm Dillon Reed & Co., Harrison Williams, and Harold T. Clark. Baruch's final report on WIB activity was much more than a history of its operations. It was also a specific plan and recommendation for economic planning in peacetime. Baruch was not content merely to summarize the lessons to be learned for planning in war or for industrial preparedness in times of uneasy peace. On the contrary, Baruch's conclusions were directed, in his own words, to the industrial practices of peace and to make recommendations relating to the business practice of normal times. The bulk of the conclusions relate to change over of a planned wartime economic system to a planned peacetime economic system, and even the suggestions for wartime practice are related to peaceful functions. Baruch suggested that the most important direct war lessons to be derived from the operation of the War Industries Board were: 1. The establishment of a peacetime skeleton organization with 50 commodity divisions meeting to keep abreast of the development of industry and develop information. The thrust of this proposal was that the information needed for peacetime planning should be collected and that the direction of the organization should stem from large-scale or major industry. 2. The government should devise some system for protecting and stimulating internal production of certain raw materials used in war. And 3. The war-related industry should be encouraged by the government to maintain skeletal organizations for wartime use. Apart from these quite elementary suggestions, Baruch is exclusively concerned in report with peacetime planning. First, we are presented with the canard that in some unstated way, the process of trade have changed and are now forced to give way before certain new principles of supervision. This non sequitur is followed by the statement: we have been gradually compelled to drift away from the old doctrine of Anglo-American law that the sphere of government should be limited to preventing breach of contract, fraud, physical injury, and injury to property, and that the government should exercise protection only over non-competent persons. It is necessary, writes Baruch, for government to reach out its arm to protect competent individuals against the discriminating practices of mass industrial power. While Baruch points to federal control of the railroads and the merchant fleet, he does not state why the representatives of big business would be the best fitted to exercise this control. In other words, why the fox is proposed as the most competent being to run the chicken coop is left unstated. Baruch then slashes at the Sherman and Clayton antitrust laws on the ground that these statutes are merely efforts to force industry into the mold of simpler principles sufficient for the conditions of a bygone day, and lauds the achievement of the War Industries Board because it had constructed hundreds of trade associations controlling prices and methods of distribution and production. Many businessmen have experienced during the war, for the first time in their careers, the tremendous advantages both to themselves and to the general public of combination, of cooperation, and common action with their natural competitors. If these cooperative attributes are not continued, argues Baruch, then businessmen will be tempted, and many of them will be unable to resist, to conduct their business for private gain with little reference to general public welfare. On the other hand, trade associations could be of the greatest public benefit to achieve the desired end of cooperation. Baruch concludes, the question then is what kind of government organization can be devised to safeguard the public interest, while these associations are preserved to carry on the good work of which they are capable. Baruch, like any good socialist, proposes government organizations to develop these principles of cooperation and coordination. If the reader will shed for a moment the idea of mutual antagonism between communism and capitalism, he will readily see in the writings of Bernard Baruch the basic objectives of Karl Marx, writing in the Communist Manifesto. What is different between the two systems are the names of the elitist few running the operation known as state planning. The vanguard of the proletariat in Marx is replaced by the vanguard of big business in Bernard Baruch. Who would gain from Baruch's proposal? The consumer? Not at all, because consumer interests are always protected by free competition in the marketplace, where goods and services are produced at the least cost in the most efficient manner, and the consumer is given maximum choice among competing producers. The gainers from Baruch's proposals would be the few who control major industrial sectors, particularly iron and steel, raw materials, electrical goods. That is, those industries already well established and fearful of competition from more enterprising newcomers. In other words, the gainers from this proposal will be Bernard Baruch and the Wall Street coterie that effectively control big business through its interlocking directorships. The gut issue then is who benefits from these proposals for trade associations and government coordination of industry. The principal, indeed the only major benefactors apart from the swarms of academic advisors, bureaucrats, and planners, would be the financial elite in Wall Street. So here we have, in Baruch's own words and ideas, an implementation of Frederick Howe's injunction to make society work for you, the monopolist. This is also in the form of a proposal comparable to Clinton Roosevelt's system. There was no evidence that Baruch had heard of Clinton Roosevelt. There was no need for him to have done so. The advantages of restraint of trade and opportunity have always been obvious to the already established enterprise. It will therefore come as no surprise to find Bernard Baruch at the very core of the Roosevelt NRA, which itself parallels many of Baruch's post-war proposals, and who had a $200,000 investment in the election of FDR, and explains why Baruch's World War I personal turn-up in the New Deal, General Hugh Johnson, for example, spent the 1920s studying industrial organization at Baruch's expense and emerged in 1933 as boss of the National Recovery Administration. It also explains why Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a Wall Streeter himself for much of the 1920s, was a co-founder with Herbert Hoover, another Wall Streeter in the 1920s, of the first of the trade associations proposed by Baruch, the American Steel Construction Association, discussed in the next chapter. Parallel to Bernard Baruch's ideas, which come to fruition in the NRA, there is a much more successful contemporary example of corporate socialism in practice: the Federal Reserve System. Paul Warburg and creation of the Federal Reserve System. Although many had a hand, or thought they had, in fashioning the Federal Reserve legislation, essentially the system was the brainchild of one man, Paul Warburg, brother of Max Warburg, whom we met in Chapter 3. Paul Moritz Warburg descended from the German banking family of Oppenheim. After early training in the offices of Samuel Montague & Co. in London and the Banque Russie pour le Commerce Stranger in Paris, Warburg entered the family banking house of M.M. Warburg & Co. in Hamburg. In 1902, Warburg became a partner in the New York banking house of Kuhn, Loeb & Co., while continuing as partner in Warburg's of Hamburg. 5 years later, in the wake of the financial panic of 1907, Warburg wrote 2 pamphlets on the U.S. banking system, Defects and Needs of Our Banking System, and a Plan for a Modified Central Bank. In the years after 1907, Warburg lost no opportunity to speak and write publicly about the need for a banking and currency reform in the United States. And in 1910, he formally proposed a United Reserve Bank of the United States. This plan developed into the Federal Reserve System, and Warburg was appointed by President Woodrow Wilson a member of the first Federal Reserve Board. Major criticism of Warburg erupted during World War I because of Brother Max's role in Germany, and he was not reappointed to the board in 1918. However, from 1921 to 1926, after criticism had abated, Warburg became a member of the Advisory Council of the Federal Reserve Board and served as its president from 1924 to 1926. After a passage of the 1913 Federal Reserve Act, Warburg and his banking associates promptly set about using the legal banking monopoly for their own ends and purposes, as suggested by Frederick Howe. In 1919, Warburg organized the American Acceptance Council and served as chairman of its executive committee in 1919-20 and as its president in 1921-22. Then, in 1921, Warburg organized and became chairman of the Private International Acceptance Bank, Inc., while still serving on the Advisory Council of the Federal Reserve Board. In 1925, Warburg added two more private acceptance banks, the American and Continental Corp. And the International Acceptance Trust Co. These banks were affiliated with the Warburg-controlled Bank of Manhattan Company. As an aside, it may be noted that Paul Warburg was also director of the American IG Chemical Corp. The American subsidiary of IG Farben in Germany, IG Farben, was prominent in bringing Hitler to power in 1933 and manufactured the Zyklonbe gas used in Nazi concentration camps. Warburg was a founding member of the Karl Schurz Memorial Foundation, a propaganda organization established in 1930, a director of the Prestige Council on Foreign Relations, Inc., and trustee of the Brookings Institution. But it was through a vital monopoly of U.S. acceptance banking achieved by the International Acceptance Bank, Inc. and its affiliated units that Warburg was able to get society to go to work for the Warburgs and their banking friends. Revisionist historian Murray Rothbard has examined the origins of the 1920s inflation that led to the collapse of 1929 and makes this pertinent observation. While purchase of U.S. securities has received more publicity, bills bought were at least as important, and indeed more important than discounts. Bills bought led the inflationary parade of reserve credit in 1921 and 1922, were considerably more important than securities in the 1924 inflationary spurt, and equally important in the 1927 spurt. Furthermore, bills bought alone continued the inflationary stimulus in the fatal last half of 1928. What were these bills bought, pinpointed by Rothbard as the key culprit of the 1929 depression? Bills bought were acceptances, and almost all were bankers' acceptances. Who created the acceptance market in the United States, largely unknown before 1920? Paul Warburg. Who gained the lion's share of the acceptance business at artificially low subsidized rates? The International Acceptance Bank, Inc. Who was the International Acceptance Bank, Inc.? Its chairman was Paul Warburg, with Felix Warburg and James Paul Warburg as co-directors. However, a closer look at the makeup of these banks, see below page 95, suggests that it was a vehicle representing the financial elite of Wall Street. Did the Warburgs and their Wall Street friends know where their financial policy would lead? In other words, did their financial policies of the 1920s have elements of deliberation? There exists a memorandum by Paul Warburg that clearly notes that banks had the capacity to prevent inflation. If the government and the banks of the United States were helpless automatons, inflation no doubt would have to ensue. But it is insulting our banks to have the impression go out that they should not be capable of cooperating in some common plan of protection, such, for instance, as keeping all cash reserves higher than required by the law, if indeed such a step should be advisable for the great safety of the country. Consequently, Rothbard quite rightly concludes, surely Warburg's leading role in the Federal Reserve System was not unconnected with his reaping of the lion's share of benefits from his acceptance policy. In brief, the policy of creating acceptances at subsidized artificial rates was not only inflationary, but was the most important factor, apparently a deliberate banking policy, leading to the inflation of the 1920s and the ultimate collapse in 1929, thus making FDR's New Deal or national economic planning appear necessary. Furthermore, this was, as Rothbard states, the grant of special privilege to a small group at the expense of the general public. In other words, Wall Street made American society go to work for a financial oligopoly. Warburg's revolutionary plan to get American society to go to work for Wall Street was astonishingly simple. Even today, in 1975, economic theoreticians cover their blackboards with meaningless equations, and the general public struggles and bewildered confusion with inflation and the coming credit collapse, while the quite simple explanation of the problem goes undiscussed and almost entirely uncomprehended. The Federal Reserve System is a legal private monopoly of the money supply operated for the benefit of a few under the guise of protecting and promoting the public interest. Revolutionary? Yes, indeed. But as one of Warburg's admiring biographers commented, Paul M. Warburg is probably the mildest-mannered man that ever personally conducted a revolution. It was a bloodless revolution. He did not attempt to rouse the populace to arms. He stepped forth armed simply with an idea. And he conquered. That is the amazing thing. A shy, sensitive man, he imposed his idea in a nation of 100 million people. How did this revolution of Warburg's differ from a socialist revolution? Only in the fact that under socialism, once the revolution is achieved and the power of the state gathered into the right ideological hands, the accrued personal rewards are not usually as substantial, although the fiefdoms carved out by National Socialist Hitler and the modern Soviets may challenge this observation, nor are the results so veiled. The monetary dictatorship of the Soviets is obvious. The monetary dictatorship of the Federal Reserve System is muted and evaded. We should then take a closer look at the International Acceptance Bank, the vehicle used for this revolutionary exploitive maneuver, because it provides valid signals that Wall Street would also have a real interest in national economic planning and FDR type of a New Deal. The International Acceptance Bank, Inc. This bank was founded in 1921 in New York and affiliated with Warburg's Bank of the Manhattan Company. However, the board of directors suggested that the most important elements in Wall Street also had a significant interest and control in and profited from the International Acceptance Bank. Further, we find a striking link-up between its affiliated financial institutions and a general scheme to establish corporate socialism in the United States. As we have noted, Paul M. Warburg was chairman of the board. His brother Felix, also a partner in Kuhn Loeb & Co., and his son, James P. Warburg, were co-directors. The vice chairman of the board was John Stewart Baker, also president and director of the Bank of Manhattan Trust Co. and International Manhattan Co., as well as chairman of the executive committee and director of the Manhattan Trust Co. Baker was also director of the American Trust Co. and the New York Title and Mortgage Co. F. Abbott Goodhue was president and director of International Acceptance Bank, on the board of the other Warburg banks, and a director of the First National Bank of Boston. Other directors of the International Acceptance Bank were Newcomb Carlton, director of the Rockefeller-controlled Chase National Bank, the Morgan-controlled Metropolitan Life Insurance Co., and other such major companies as the American Express Co., the American Sugar Refining Co., and the American Telegraph and Cable Co. Newcomb Carlton was also a director of American Telegraph and Cable and a director of American International Corporation, a company intimately involved with the Bolshevik Revolution. Another director of International Acceptance Bank, who was also a director of American International Corps, was Charles A. Stone, located at 120 Broadway and a director of the Federal Reserve Bank from 1919 to 1932. Bronson Winthrop was also a director of American International Corps and an International Acceptance Corps. Thus, 3 directors of the International Acceptance Bank had interlocking directorships with American International Corps, the key vehicle in U.S. involvement in the Bolshevik Revolution. Another director of International Acceptance Bank was David Franklin Houston, who was also director of the Carnegie Corps, the Morgan-controlled Guaranty Trust Co., U.S. Steel, and AT&T, as well as president of the Mutual Life Insurance Company. Other directors of IAB included Philip Stockton, president of the First National Bank of Boston, and a director of AT&T, General Electric, International Power Securities, and many other companies. William Skinner, director of Irving Trust Co., Equitable Life Assurance, and the Union Square Savings Bank. Charles Bronson Seeger, director of Aviation Corps, Guaranty Trust Co., and W.A. Harriman, Otto V. Skrank, director of Agafka Ensco Corps, Krupp Nerosta, and Mercedes-Benz Co., and Henry Tatnall, director of Girard Trust Co. Paul Warburg was also a director of Agfa Ensco Inc., a firm 60% owned by IG Farben and a front for IG in the United States. In sum, the directors of International Acceptance Bank reflected the most powerful sectors of Wall Street, the Morgans, the Rockefellers, and Harriman, as well as Boston bankers. Further, there was a lifelong intimate Warburg association with the Roosevelts from childhood to the New Deal. This Warburg-Roosevelt association is illustrated by an extract from James P. Warburg's memoirs, It so happened that I had known the president-elect's eldest son, James Roosevelt, for some years, because he had been living in one of the cottages of my Uncle Felix's estate in White Plains. Later the same, James P. Warburg became advisor to President Franklin D. Roosevelt on domestic and international monetary affairs. The Warburgs' deep interest in the NRA program is reflected in a 1933 Warburg memorandum to FDR. Memorandum for the President: domestic currency problem the administration has, in my judgment, ever faced a more serious situation than it does today. The entire recovery program, which is the heart of its policy, is jeopardized by uncertainty and doubt in the monetary field. The National Recovery Act cannot possibly function to any useful end if there is fear of currency depreciation of an unknown amount and fear as to monetary experimentation. There has already been a tremendous flight of capital, and this flight will continue at an increasing pace so long as uncertainty prevails. Then, following the Warburg proclivity for monopoly, James Warburg recommended to FDR that all monetary ideas, actions, and decisions be centralized in the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve Board. Obviously, this proposal would ensure that all monetary decisions were made from the elitist groups associated with the International Acceptance Bank and the Federal Reserve System. The Secretary of the Treasury in July 1933, when James Warburg wrote his memorandum to FDR, was William H. Wooden, who had been director of FRB of New York from 1925 to 1931. We can also cite FDR's own association with the Federal Reserve System. His favorite uncle, Frederick Delano, was appointed vice chairman of the Federal Reserve Board by President Woodrow Wilson in 1914, and from 1931 to 1936, Delano served as chairman of the board of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, Virginia. FDR appointed Delano chairman of the National Resources Planning Board in 1934. In 1933-34, the United States faced the greatest financial crisis in its history, and what did FDR do? He called in as the financial doctors the very operators responsible for the crisis. As sensible a policy as allowing the lunatics to run the asylum. So we find associations between Franklin D. Roosevelt, the Warburg family, and the Warburg-inspired central banking system, ranging from childhood to Warburg's appointment as a key monetary advisor to FDR. We shall see later that it was Warburg who determined the final shape of the National Industrial Recovery Administration. On the other hand, the Warburg family and their Wall Street friends controlled the private monopoly money supply known as the Federal Reserve System, and through the International Acceptance Bank exploited that monopoly for their own purposes. The Founding Fathers demonstrated a profound wisdom and insight into the dangers of monopoly of paper money issue that reflected in Article 1, Section 9 of the U.S. Constitution. No state shall make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts. A constitutional challenge to the issue of the Federal Reserve notes by a private banking monopoly, the Federal Reserve System is overdue. Hopefully the value of the dollar will not have to be reduced to zero, as the mark was in post-World War I Germany, before such a challenge is initiated and sustained by the Supreme Court of the United States. Okay. Chapter 7. Roosevelt, Hoover, and the Trade Councils. People of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices. Adam Smith, An Inquiry into the Nature and Cause of the Wealth of Nations. The idea of getting society to work for a privileged group within that society originated neither among the corporate socialists in Wall Street, nor in the financial community at large, nor even among Marxist socialists. In fact, the notion predates our own industrial society, and there's an interesting parallel between the codes of the New Deal America, which we shall examine later, and 13th century trade legislation in England. A medieval ideal. In 1291, the tanners of Norwich, England, were brought before the local court charged with organizing and coding their tanning activities to the detriment of local citizens. 2 years later, in 1293, the cobblers and saddle makers of Norwich were faced with similar charges. By greasing the legislators, the political power structure of medieval Norwich was brought around to the view that perhaps the tanners needed protection. After all, this protection came to incorporate the same basic principles of economic planning that almost 700 years later were put forward in the Roosevelt New Deal. So in 1307, the tanning industry of Norwich was legally coded and wages and conditions of work prescribed, all done under the guise of protecting the consumer but in practice granting a legal monopoly to the tanners. In the decades before the New Deal, during the 1920s, Wall Street or Roosevelt was active on behalf of business to promote these same basic ideas of using the police power of the state to restrain trade, to advance cooperation, and to utilize government regulation to inhibit unwelcome competition from more efficient outsiders. The trade associations of the 1920s were more demure in their proposal plans than the 13th century Norwich tanners, but the underlying principles was the same. Unfortunately, Franklin D. Roosevelt's role in the Wall Street of the 1920s had been ignored by the historians. Daniel Fussfield does correctly observe that FDR took an active part in the trade association movement that was to develop into the NRA of the early New Deal. On the other hand, Fussfield, who offers the only extensive description of FDR's business activities, concludes that his attitude towards business was a curious mixture. FDR, says Fussfield, was insistent that mere profits were not a full justification for a business activity. Then a businessman must also have the motive of public service. This, to Fussfield, was inconsistent with participation in a number of outright speculative and promotional ventures that had little to do with serving the public. Fussfield and his fellow historians of the Roosevelt era have failed to note that public service for a businessman is absolutely consistent with profit maximization. In fact, public service is the easiest and certainly the most lucrative road to profit maximization. Further, the riskier and more speculative the business, presumably the greater is the advantage to be gained from public service. When we take this more realistic view of social do-goodism, then Wall Street or Roosevelt's attitude towards business is not at all curious. In fact, it is consistent. In fact, it is a consistent program of profit maximization. All right. The American Construction Council. The American Construction Council, ACC, formed in May 1922, was the first of numerous trade associations created in the 1920s. Devices used to raise prices and reduce output. The original proposal and the drive for the council came from Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover, and the council operated under the leadership of Franklin D. Roosevelt, then just beginning his Wall Street career, following his service as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. The stated public objectives of the ACC were a code of ethics, a euphemism for a restraint of trade, efficiency and standardization of production. Most importantly, but less publicized, the ACC was to provide the industry with an opportunity to fix its own price and production levels without fear of antitrust prosecutions by the government. The New York Times reported, "It is these tremendous possibilities and dedication to the public service and the elimination of waste that have fired the imaginations of Mr. Hoover and Mr. Roosevelt and invited them to accept positions of leadership in the movement. Like the price-fixing committees of Baruch's War Industries Board, the ACC was in effect a primitive industry association, although the high-sounding stated object of the council was to place the construction industry on a high plane of integrity and efficiency and to correlate the efforts towards betterment made by existing agencies through an association dedicated to the improvement of the service within the construction industry. And so to stabilize conditions for the benefit of the industry, labor, and general public. This objective was also Baruch's objective for peacetime trade associations to regulate industry under government control while citing the public good. In the American Construction Council, the public good was announced as the elimination of the scandals founded by Lockwood Commission investigating the New York public building industry. However, as the scandal dealt in great part with exclusive dealing and similar coercive conditions forced upon contractors and erectors by the United States Steel Corporation and Bethlehem Steel, the announced public good makes little sense. These industry giants were controlled by the Morgan interests on Wall Street, who were, as we shall see, also at the root of the ACC proposal. In brief, the alleged antisocial conditions to be solved by a trade association could have been halted much more simply and effectively by a memorandum from J.P. Morgan and his associates. There was no necessity to promote a trade association to halt such abuses. So we must look elsewhere for the reason for trade associations. The real reason, of course, is to protect industry from unwelcome competition and to establish monopoly conditions for those already in the business. As Howe told us, a legal monopoly is the sure road to profit. It was formation of this legal monopoly that induced Roosevelt and Herbert Hoover to join hands against the public interest. According to Friedel, FDR's friend Elliot Brown warned him against the socialistic tendencies of these associations and of Hoover specifically. Socialistic, because the moment a combination is formed, the government will assert an interest and will express that interest through the medium of some clerk in the Department of Commerce, who will approve or disapprove many matters affecting the initiative and wealth of all people. FDR's role is not really surprising. He was then attempting to get a business career underway. He had political contacts and was more than willing, indeed eager, to use these. On the other hand, there was an odd dichotomy in the ideas and practices of Herbert Hoover in this area of the relationship between government and business. Herbert Hoover declared his adherence to the principles of free enterprise and individual initiative and his suspicion of government intervention. These assertions were mixed with other contrary statements, encouraging, indeed authorizing government intervention on almost trivial grounds. Unfortunately, Herbert Hoover's memoirs, the only finally authoritative sources, do not resolve these conflicts. The American Construction Council is not mentioned in Herbert Hoover's memoirs, although Volume 2, The Cabinet and the Presidency, underlines the evils of government intervention in the economy, pointing to communism, socialism, and fascism to comment. This left-wing cure for all business evil now appears as national planning. Hoover added that business abuses were only marginal, and rather than having government intervention beyond and better than even, that was cooperation in the business community to cure its own abuses. On the other hand, Hoover's private correspondence with Roosevelt on the American Construction Council suggests that Hoover, while in favor of government intervention, was careful to disguise this continuing interest for fear of bringing public opposition down upon his own head and ruining the proposal. A letter from Hoover to Roosevelt dated June the 12th, 1923 makes this point. June 12, 1923, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Vice President, Fidelity and Deposit Company of Maryland, 120 Broadway, New York City. My dear Roosevelt, I am in somewhat of a quandary about your telegram of July the 7th. I had hoped that the Construction Council would be solely originated from the industries without pressure from the administration. Otherwise, it will soon take on the same opposition that all governmental touches to this problem immediately accrue. The vast sentiment of the business community against government interference tends to destroy even a voluntary effort if it is thought to be carried on at government inspiration. Yours faithfully, Herbert Hoover. In any event, the American Construction Council was a cooperative association of business, labor, and government. Formed at Washington on June the 19th, at the suggestion and under the guise of Secretary Hoover of the Department of Commerce, who has taken the first step toward putting into operation a program of construction effort which, it is hoped, will eliminate many of the evils which have developed in the industry during the past decade. Thus, it was the free enterpriser Herbert Hoover who became the sponsor of the first of the trade associations, the American Construction Council, which was designed to include architects, engineers, construction labor, general contractors, subcontractors, materials and equipment manufacturers, material and equipment dealers, bond, insurance, and real estate interests, and the construction departments of the federal, state, and municipal governments. The organization meeting of American Construction Council was held at FDR's house in New York and attended by about 20 persons. This group discussed the concept of council and particularly whether it should be a clearinghouse for the different national associations, a clerical clearinghouse, or whether it should be an active, aggressive, militant organization in the service of the public good of the construction industry. It was unanimously decided that the council should be a militant, aggressive organization and not a clearinghouse for information. This concept was discussed with Dwight Morrow of J.P. Morgan firm, with Mr. Dick, Secretary to Judge Gary of the U.S. Steel Corporation, with Gano Dunn, President of J.G. White Engineering Corporation, and with Stone & Webster. It is interesting to know that most of these persons and firms are prominent in my previous volume, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. After the financial establishment had expressed support of ACC, the construction industry at large was approached for its reaction. This preliminary work culminated in an organizational meeting at the Hotel Washington, D.C. on Tuesday, June the 20th, 1922. Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected president of the council, and John B. Larner, vice president of the American Bankers Association, was elected treasurer. The chairman of the finance committee was Willis H. Booth of Guaranty Trust Company. The committee then established its committees and laid down priorities for its problems. Roosevelt's interpretation of the causes for the problems of the construction industry were reported by the New York Times. Muddling through has been the characteristic method employed by the construction industry for the last few years. There's been no system, no cooperation, no invested national planning. After pointing out that a railroad man is not laid off because of bad weather, Roosevelt commented, "In construction work, however, we have that great bugbear in our economic life, the seasonal job. All the work is crowded into the summer months. None of the work is carried on during the winter. The result of this piling on are plain. In the summer, we have a scarcity of labor and skyrocketing of prices. In the winter, unemployment and cutting of incomes. The only thing that lasts throughout the year is the bitterness of men engaged in the work." How did FDR propose to change this? A large part of the work can be spread over the year. There is no reason in the world why a skilled mechanic living in New York, for instance, should be called down in June to help put up a public building in Georgia. Georgia can build in seasons of the year in which it is impossible for New York to build. So can Louisiana. So can all the southern states. Roosevelt's suggestion, an aimless non sequitur, was that the construction industry must get together on this situation, move construction materials during off-season, and spread labor around. At an early Board of Governors meeting held at FDR's home in New York on May the 16th, 1923, FDR called attention to the Road Council had followed. The American Construction Council was organized, but frankly it had not done one darn thing from that time to this, except collect dues from some 150 different organizations, I think. FDR put the basic choice to the Assembly of Governors. Did they want to continue the old way, build all we can, paying any old price as long as we get the orders? Because if that was the case, said FDR, we might just as well join. On the other hand, he continued that it did not appear to be the view of the majority, and we want to go back to the real basic purpose of the council, which was to prevent this sort of thing. Then followed a series of proposed resolutions adopted unanimously that would have the effect of slowing down construction. The council continued to have its problems summarized in a letter of April the 29th, 1924, from Executive Vice President Dr. Knickerbocker Boyd to Franklin D. Roosevelt to call attention to the very serious condition of affairs existing at this time. Boyd reminded FDR that the Executive Secretary Dwight L. Hoopengarner had served particularly without pay, and that $7,000 in back salary was owed to him. Boyd added, "This is not just a right, and it should not be allowed to continue. He should not only be paid all back fees promptly, but assured of prompt pay in the future, or the work should be stopped." Then Boyd commented that he too expected recompense for the time expended on council work, noting that time expended to date amounted to $3,168.41. In addition to traveling expenses, Boyd suggested the council face up squarely to its responsibilities, place itself on an adequate financial footing, or dissolve. The final paragraph of Boyd's letter demonstrates the fundamental objective of those planning the American Construction Council. If the council should go out of existence, it would, in my opinion, be a countrywide calamity, as I doubt whether after this second effort to nationalize the great building industry on human lines, enough people with enthusiasm, faith, and patience could be found to make a third attempt. Franklin D. Roosevelt, president of American Construction Council, had argued for economic planning. Now the executive vice president acknowledges an effort to nationalize the construction industry. This effort to organize the construction industry under the somnolent eye of the government, study for the public good, failed. Okay, that's all we have for tonight. And again, thank you, Minoan and Record Deepness, and whoever else tuned in for tonight. It's Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.